So in this lesson we are going to look at sexual and asexual reproduction and inheritance. So the learning outcome, the intention of this lesson and what we're going to look at, and by the end of it hopefully, students should be able to describe asexual and sexual reproduction, explore patterns in the inheritance and variation of genetically controlled characteristics. So we're going to look at what these are. Okay, so the first thing we kind of want to look at is this idea of what's called asexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction is the formation of new individuals from one parent. So organisms produced by asexual reproduction are identical to the parent. So imagine if we have an organism. Okay, so this is our organism here. Okay, so imagine, so this is organism. And what happens is instead of it reproducing what's called sexually, it can reproduce asexually. So basically what it can do is it's like you being able to make a clone of yourself. So it can divide, if you like, or reproduce and make two copies that are exactly the same as the parent. So imagine this is the parent. So these guys are exactly the same. These two guys here are exactly the same as the parent. Okay, so they're literally identical to them. And again, they can go on and reproduce as well and produce offspring that will be identical. So basically all of the generations are basically copies of each other. Okay, so they're literally identical to each other. So there's very little variation between them. Okay, so their characteristics are the same. So asexual reproduction allows plants to reproduce very quickly without requiring wind or insects to carry out any steps. Strawberry plants reproduce asexually by producing horizontal stems called runners. So this is your strawberry plant here, and it produces these horizontal runners. And then out of those horizontal runners, you will grow an identical strawberry plant to the parent. So buds on these runners can grow into new plants. So again, you get these little buds like here, and then what happens is they grow into a new plant. So cuttings then are artificial methods of promoting asexual reproduction in plants. So what happens is you can take, like say, a section here and cut it off and bring it with you and plant it. So the stem is cut at the leaf point and placed in compost. So rooting powder can be added to promote root growth then as well. So cuttings ensure useful features of a plant such as colour or taste or are repeated to the next generation. So if you have a plant, let's say a strawberry plant, so this is your strawberry plant here, and you find that this particular strawberry plant is producing really nice and juicy strawberries, what you can do is you can take a cutting, okay, and then you can plant that, and what will happen is it will reproduce, it'll reproduce asexually, and what will happen is you'll basically get identical copies of the original plant. So this will literally, it's a way to copy it and make two more like identical plants to the original one. Okay, so literally they will be carbon copies, as they say. So that means that, so for example, if the parent plant had like really juicy strawberries, then what's going to happen is the cloned copies of it, or the copies of the plant that reproduce the asexually, they are going to be exactly the same. And then what happens is you're keeping those characteristics, so you are from, let's say, one generation to the next. So that is asexual reproduction. So basically what happens is the parent basically divides and makes two copies of itself, and the two copies are clones or identical to the parent. Okay, so and plants have the ability to reproduce sexually, and then they also have the ability to reproduce asexually as well. Now, sexual reproduction, and generally it's animals that reproduce sexually. So sexual reproduction is the formation of new individuals from two parents. So in order for sexual reproduction to happen, there has to be a male and a female of the species that wants to reproduce sexually. The offspring of sexual reproduction are genetically different to their parents. So it's not the same setup as this. What happens is the offspring are completely, well, not completely, but they have characteristics from both the father and the female and the male from the species. So it just means from a genetic point of view, the the offspring are different than the parents. From a genetic point of view, in the plants, from asexual reproduction, they are identical. But when you have sexual reproduction, the offspring are not identical to the parents. They might have some of the characteristics of the parents, but they are not identical. So humans reproduce sexually by producing male and female gametes. So gametes are like what are called sex cells. So you get what's called a sperm and an egg, and each gamete has half the number of chromosomes needed for the new individual. So if we take, for example, let's say, a human cell. So inside the human cell, so imagine this is the cell, and then inside the cell you have the nucleus. Okay, and then inside this nucleus, you have these like what are called libraries. They're what are called chromosomes. And chromosomes have what's known as genes, or they carry genetic information, and the language for that is it's what's called DNA. So you have these. So inside the nucleus, you have chromosomes, and then the chromosomes have genes. And then the genes are written in this language that's called DNA. And the genes are like what give you your like features, like things like your characteristics, like your eye color, for example, or your hair type, things like that. So, and all of this is contained inside the nucleus, and it's contained the information or the blueprint for making those characteristics are contained in what are called chromosomes, and then it's stored in information in these sections called genes, and the language of that is DNA. It's the chemical makeup of these chromosomes and genes. So what happens then is fertilization is when the male gamete fuses with the female gamete to form a single cell called a zygote. And the zygote divides many times to form an embryo and then a baby. And the baby will have features from both parents. So this is sexual reproduction. So again, you have the male here and you have the female. Male produces sperm. The sperm has these chromosomes. It has 23 chromosomes. Okay, and then the female produces an egg in the ovum. It has 23 chromosomes as well. And then what happens is the sperm and the egg come into contact with each other during fertilization, and it produces this cell called a zygote. And basically what it's doing then is it's taken the genetic information from the father and the genetic information from the mother and combining them together. So the genetic information or the features or characteristics are carried in these chromosomes. So the sperm, for example, will have 23 like libraries, if you like, of genes from the father, and the mother will have 23 libraries of genes from the mother in the sex cell called the gamete. And then when these come together, these libraries or chromosomes of information, they get combined together, and then what happens is this zygote, then it forms into an embryo, and then it forms into a person, into a baby, and it will have some of the characteristics of the mother and some of the characteristics of the father. So for example, like the mother might have brown eyes, and there will be a chromosome, there will be a gene, let's say, that had the gene for brown eyes, and that will be stored in a library called a chromosome. So that will be stored in here. So the eye color chromosome will be stored in here, and then the eye color chromosome from the father will be stored in here then as well. And then what will happen is the embryo will inherit that characteristic from the father and the mother in the form of genes. So basically, genes are how animals, and also how plants as well, how they pass on information. But unlike plants, when plants reproduce asexually, literally, like whatever, let's say, type of leaf or whatever type of strawberry the strawberry plant is producing, the offspring will be they will produce identical strawberries. Whereas if you take humans, for example, the new human that's formed will have similar characteristics to both mother and father, but not identical. It won't be a carbon copy. There will be differences. So if you were to go into, let's say, any cell in your body, and you were to go into the nucleus of the cell, and you were to count the number of these libraries, chromosomes, you will have 46 chromosomes. So there's going to be 46 of them. Okay, so you get half of those chromosomes from your mum. Okay, so you get 23 from your mum and 23 from your dad. Okay, so that's basically, and that makes up the 46. And then those, you think about them, they're like libraries of, they're libraries basically, and each section has a plan, if you like, or a blueprint on how to produce a particular part of your body. So for example, in your eye, there will be a gene for eye color, and the language of the gene is DNA. And then that gene then will be stored on a particular chromosome. And then if you were to look in, like if you were to go to the eye, for example, in a human, so imagine this is your eye. So inside the eye here, in this part, you will have cells like this. And inside those cells, you will have chromosomes, and they will make proteins that will give you a particular eye color. Like, for example, you might have blue eyes. Okay, so that's sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. Okay, so now, as I say, plants can reproduce asexually, but they can also produce sexually as well. So again, remember, in sexual reproduction, the sex cells or the gametes have to come into contact with each other and mix, and then they turn into a zygote, and then they turn into the next generation of the species. So plants can reproduce either asexually or sexually. The flowers of plants contain a stamen, which produces the male pollen grain, and carpels, which hold the egg. Okay, so essentially what you have is you have this part here, so you have these structures here that are called stamen. It has the anterior and it has the filament section, but basically what this contains is it contains the male sexual, it contains the male gamete, or the male sexual cell. And then inside this part here, so this is like the male part of the plant, and then this is the female part of the plant. Okay, so it's called the carpel, and again it has these sections here. And basically what happens is you have to get, so the sex cell that's in here has to mix with the sex cell that's in here. So what happens is the flowering part, the flower, so basically, and this is all in the flower of the plant. So the flowers of plants contain stamen, which produces the male pollen grain, and carpels, which holds the egg. Okay, so this is the stamen, this part here, and then this is the carpel, the male and female part. So pollination then occurs when wind or insects carry pollen from the male stamen to the female carpel. So basically the eggs that are on here have to be brought to here, and then that is, like, if you like, sexual reproduction happens when that happens. So what can happen is an animal, or sorry, an insect, for example, can come to, it's attracted to the plant, and the male sex cells will attach onto the insect, and then when it flies off and lands on another plant, what will happen is the sex cells from this plant will mix, will get in here, and then it's like impregnating, if you like, this particular like flower. So fertilization occurs when a pollen tube carries the male gamete from the pollen grain to fuse with the female gamete in the carpel, forming a zygote. And the zygote develops inside the ovary into a seed and surrounded by a fruit. So what will happen is once fertilization happens, then this flower will turn into a fruit, and inside the fruit then there's a seed, and then that seed is dispersed, or it falls off and lands on the ground, and then out of that grows a new plant. So seed dispersal, so seeds can be dispersed by wind or animals, allowing the seeds to avoid competition with their parent plant for space. So germination occurs when water, oxygen, and suitable temperatures allow the seed to grow into a new plant. So a way to kind of think about it is, so this section here, is like the male part of the plant, and then this section here is like the female. So basically what happens is, so imagine there are cells here that need to get from here up to here. So once these cells that are in here, they get to here, then what will happen is then it'll allow like pollination happens. So basically what will happen is an insect, so let's say this is the insect here, so it'll fly along and it'll land here. So it's attracted to, it wants to get nectar from the plant. And then this insect will, these pieces of pollen will attach onto the insect here, like so. And then this insect then will fly from this plant and it might fly over to, let's say, plant 2 here, like so. And when it does that, what it'll do is it will deposit, basically what will happen is the sex cells from this male part of the plant will be deposited here, if you like, onto the female part of the plant. And that's essentially what's happening, is that these two sex cells are coming into contact with each other. And then basically what will happen then is so imagine this is the sex cell, that's coming from the other male plant, that's coming from this part here. So what will happen is this will grow down in, so it'll send this long fiber down inside the female part of the plant, and then inside the female part of the plant, so basically so the two, let's say the egg that's in the oval of the plant will come into contact with the male sex cell, and the two of these will join together. And then what will happen then is this will turn into a fruit. Okay, so imagine it's like a piece of fruit, it'll turn into a fruit. And then basically what can happen is this fruit then can be, like, animals can come and eat it, and then they can spread it, or the fruit can drop off and it can land on the ground. So imagine then the fruit here is on the ground, like so. So the fruit here is on the ground, and if conditions are right, so for example, if there's enough oxygen, and there's enough light, and there's enough, for example, water, what will happen is this fruit will start to grow. Okay, so it'll start to put down roots into the ground, and then what will happen is you will get, like, it will start to, like, if you like, start to grow into a new plant. Okay, and then it'll produce a flower, and then you'll get the same kind of process that will start all over again. So that's basically how plants can reproduce sexually as well. Okay, so variation then. So variation are differences between individuals of a particular population. So if we have a look here, so for example, we have a population. So the population is like to be part of the population. So for example, like there's a population of giraffes. So in order to be part of that population, you have to be a giraffe. So variations are differences between individual populations. So if you were to go out into Africa and you were to look at a family of giraffes, they all have similar features, but they're not identical. So there's going to be differences. Like some of them will be different colors, some of them will have different patterns of spots, some of them will have like different lengths of necks, they'll have different size feet, different eye colors, etc., etc. So these are what are known as variations. So in asexual reproduction, like what we talked about here, there's no variation in the population. So basically, all the plants are exactly the same. But if plants reproduce sexually, there will be differences. So they will be part of the same species, but there will be slight differences between one plant and another. Like, it might be slightly different color of the leaves, they might grow to different heights, etc., etc. So there's going to be some what's called variation. So in the sexual reproduction, there is variation, and the same with the human population as well. If you look at a family, for example, of people, there will be similar features, they'll be similar to each other, but they will not all be identical. They'll have some differences, apart from, for example, if there's identical twins. So inherited characteristics are passed from parent to offspring. So humans differ in height, hair color, skin tone, eye color, and many other ways. Plants within the same species differ in height, petal color, seed shape, and other ways. So again, there's a vast variety of variation, for example, in the human population and also then even within plants population as well. So so you have these what are called inherited characteristics. So things like your height, your hair color, your skin tone, your eye color, these are all inherited, for example, from your parents. So these are kind of things that you're born with. And then you have what are known as non-inherited characteristics. So these are things that you can learn. So for example, non-inherited characteristics are learned or acquired from the environment. So for example, humans are really good at learning. Humans can learn to swim, play a musical instrument, and speak a second language. So these are what are known. You're not just born with these traits, you learn them. So plants are affected by their environment, so plants growing in nitrogen poor soil will remain small despite having genes allowing for taller growth as well. So again, the environment has an impact on the organism. So if plants, for example, are trying to grow in soil that doesn't have enough nitrogen in it or fertilizer in it, they will not, even though they have the genetic material to allow them to grow tall, they will not be able, if the environment doesn't support that particular gene, then that gene, they will not get to express that gene, if you like. And that's the same with people as well. If you are born, for example, into a country and you are nurtured, or you're born into a family and you're nurtured, basically, you will be able to learn all of these different skills. Whereas if you are born into a country or a family that doesn't nurture those skills, then even though those abilities might be within you, they will not get expressed. So then to kind of understand like how these characteristics gets passed on, this is what we need to look at. So we need to look at the nucleus, the chromosomes, and the DNA. So we talked about we have a cell. Inside the nucleus of the cell, inside the cell, you have the nucleus, and the nucleus is like the control center of the cell. So the nucleus is the control center of the cell that contains chromosomes. So chromosomes are thread-like structures found in the nucleus of the cell. So this is like what a chromosome looks like. Chromosomes are made up of DNA and protein. DNA and protein. So DNA is a long molecule containing chemicals arranged to form a pattern or code that stores information about the organism. Okay, so it's made up of DNA. Humans' cells have 46 chromosomes occurring in pairs. So gametes such as sperm and eggs have 23 chromosomes each, so one from each pair. After fertilization, a zygote cell is formed that has 46 chromosomes capable of dividing to form the many cells of a new organism. So this is basically how this genetic information is stored and how it's passed on from one generation to the next. It's passed on through these things called chromosomes and DNA. So how does this work then? So how does DNA and genes relate to your inheritance or the features that you take on? So humans have approximately 25,000 genes. So remember, genes are sections of DNA that code for a particular trait that you have. Every person has 2 copies of each gene, one inherited from each parent. So for example, there will be a gene for eye color. So you'll inherit a gene from your mother for eye color, and you'll inherit a gene from your father for eye color. Genes are sections of DNA that control characteristics such as eye color. Genes carry a code for the production of proteins in the cell. The protein produced results in a particular trait or characteristic. So this is kind of like what it looks like. So you have DNA, and this might be a section of DNA that's called a gene, and this would be the gene for eye color. So what happens is this DNA, it helps your body to make certain proteins. So proteins are made up of these things called amino acids. These amino acids join together and they form like a protein structure. And then that protein structure will have like characteristics, like there'll be a protein for your eye color, for example. So that's how it goes from from DNA to protein to the particular characteristic that you have. So gene expression then is the process by which the instruction that's inside the DNA is used to form a protein, which is in turn affects the characteristics such as eye color. So you go from DNA to protein to the particular characteristic. So inheritance is the way characteristics are passed from one generation to the next, as copies of genes are passed from one parent to gametes to offspring. So what happens is during reproduction, these instructions are passed on from one generation to the next. And basically these instructions they code the proteins that make up all the different parts of your body, and those proteins are what give you the particular characteristics that you might have, like for example eye color. So there's a gene for eye color. That gene arranges the building blocks of proteins, which are amino acids, into a particular structure. That structure is a protein, and that protein has a particular characteristic, like for example it gives a particular eye color. So the way then that it works is you get a gene. Okay, so imagine you have a gene. That gene gives you a protein. Imagine you have a particular protein. And then that protein gives you a particular feature. So imagine you have like a feature. So for example, you could have there's a protein for eye color. Okay, and then that's the color of your eye. And then it's going to have like a sequence of DNA that makes up the gene that gives you that. Okay, so that's kind of like the way it works. So we need some kind of language to be able to talk about these genes. Okay, so the different types of genes that you have. So there's two types of genes then. Okay, so remember you have a particular eye color, and inside your eye you have the gene that you got from your mother and the gene that you got from your father. So, and genes can come in two types. So you have a dominant and you have a recessive gene. Okay, so every characteristic is controlled by a pair of genes. Each gene can occur in two forms. So dominant genes always produce the characteristic they control when present and prevent the action of the recessive gene. So recessive genes only produce their characteristics when the dominant gene is absent. Okay, so eye color is controlled by two genes. So we have like the recessive and the dominant version. So we use this letter to represent the gene. So for example, the letter B represents the dominant eye color gene, and then we have this small b, which represents the recessive version of it. Okay, so the dominant version is what gives us brown eyes, and the recessive version is what gives us green or blue eyes. So eye color is controlled by two genes. B produces brown eyes and is dominant, whereas small b produces blue eyes and is what's called recessive. So every organism has the same pair of genes in all their cells, either BB, B small b, or BB. So what happens is for example, when organisms reproduce, for example, one part of the eye color gene comes from the male, and the other part of the eye color gene comes from, or the other eye color gene comes from the female. So depending on which of these two you get, that determines which eye color you'll have. So for example, the genes they join up together. So for example, if you were to go into the eyes of this particular individual here, so there will be two eye color genes in there, and it depends on which ones and both of those are inherited from their parents. One of them will be from the mum, one of them will be from the dad, and depending on what they have. So if they have the dominant version, so if one of the two eye color genes they have is dominant, then what will happen is that gene will be expressed. So for example, if a person has brown eyes, they will have either this pair, so they'll have two dominants, BB. They will have this, a dominant and a recessive version, but they'll not have this. In order for a person to have blue eyes, they will have to have two recessive BB genes inherited from both parents. So that's what they mean. So the genotype is the type of genes that you have. Okay, so in order to have blue eyes, you have to have this genotype. You have to have two recessive versions of the blue eye gene. And when we're talking about these, like when we're talking about these particular genes, the recessive and the dominant version, we use letters to represent the trait, and then we use like a capital letter to represent the dominant version of that trait, and then the smaller non-capitalized letter to represent the recessive version of that trait. So that's really important, and this is the example with brown eyes. So we have these two things called the genotype and then what's called the phenotype. So the phenotype of an organism is the physical appearance of the organism caused by its genes. So for example, their eye color is an example of phenotype. So phenotype means like how, like the physical manifestations of a particular gene. So like what the organism looks like. So the genes located in an organism are known as its genotype. So if you were to take that organism and you're to go down into its DNA and go into its nucleus and look at its chromosomes, you're looking at its genotype. So phenotype is like what the organism looks like, and then genotype is the actual genes that the organism has. So the genotype is expressed as the phenotype. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these. So the dominant genotype is represented by the capital letter of the characteristic, and the recessive characteristic uses the lowercase of the same letter. So let's have a look at a couple of these. So if we have this one here, okay, so you can have a cleft in your chin. Okay, so you can either have a cleft or not have a cleft. So it looks something like this. So the letter that we use to represent that trait is C. Okay, so the dominant version would be a capital C, and that would give the phenotype of having a cleft in your chin, whereas a small c is the recessive type, and that would code for not having a cleft in your chin. So in order for the actual organism, or in order for the person to either have a cleft or not have a cleft, if they have two dominant versions of that genotype, what will happen is their phenotype they will have a cleft. Okay, if they have one dominant and one recessive, again they'll have a cleft, and if they have two recessive, okay, there will be no cleft. Okay, so that's the genotype are the genes that they have, and then the phenotype is like the characteristic that's expressed because of those genes. So other examples then are the widow's peak. So this like kind of peak at the front of the head here, and no widow's peak. So for example, you could represent that with, let's say the dominant version would be W and the recessive version would be a small w. Now in order for the person to have a widow's peak, they'd have to have two, so they'd have to get a dominant version from the mother and a dominant version from the father, so therefore they will have that, they will express this widow's peak. Okay, so they will have it. If they have, let's say, a dominant with a recessive, okay, they will also have it as well. But if they have like just two recessives like this, they will not have the widow's peak. Okay, and then other examples then are like dimples, for example, brown or black hair. Okay, so that's their other characteristics. Freckles or no freckles, brown eyes or blue eyes, or free earlobes or attached earlobes. Okay, so these are all traits or phenotypes that can be expressed depending on the particular type of genotype that you have. So pairs of genes. So for example, when you have these pairs of genes like this, when they're like you have two pairs of genes, Pairs of genes are called alleles. Okay, so it's just a word that you have to learn. That's what they're called. So when gametes are formed, each gamete will randomly receive one gene from each pair of alleles. So a person with the genotype BB can produce only gametes that contain BB. A person with a genotype of BB can produce only gametes that contain B. A person with a genotype of B, capital B, small b, can produce two possible types of gametes, either the dominant or the recessive. And in reality, many gametes are produced, some with B and some with small b, and each gamete has an equal chance of fertilization, so both possibilities are studied. So alleles are pairs, so allele pairs separate, and each goes into a different gamete. Okay, so let's say, for example, if you're a male and you will produce sperm cells, okay, so depending on the particular, let's say, for example, if your genotype for eye color is BB, two dominant versions, each of your sperms basically will have only the dominant version of the gamete, of the particular gene. If you have a mixed genotype, like you have the dominant and the recessive, some of your sperm will have a dominant version of that gene, and some of them will have a recessive version of that gene. Okay, so it'll be a mixture of both. And the same then as well, if you're a female, for example, the same will apply to you as well. So what we can start to do then is we can start to look at these traits and make predictions. And we can use these things called genetic crosses. So up here we have the mother, okay, and the mother has the alleles. So the mother has a dominant, so the mother's genes for eye color has one dominant gene and one recessive gene. Okay, and then the father has one dominant gene and one recessive gene. So that means that the mother's eggs, for example, that she produces, it could have either the recessive version of that gene or the dominant version of that gene. And the same then for the father, the sperm that the father produces could either have the dominant version of the gene for eye color or the recessive version of the gene. So then when fertilization happens, so when the sperm meets the egg and fertilization happens, what will happen is there can be different variations of what the offspring will inherit from mother and father. So a mother has brown eyes and has the genes BB, and a father also has brown eyes and has the genes BB. So each parent can produce gametes that can contain either the recessive version or the non-recessive version, or the dominant version or the recessive version. The table shows the possible gametes each parent can produce and the 4 possible ways the gametes can be combined. And there is a 3 in 4 chance that a child will have brown eyes and a 1 in 4 chance that the child will have blue eyes. So for example, if during fertilization the mother's egg contained the dominant version and the father's sperm contained the dominant version, then you're going to have in the zygote that's formed, you will have it'll be disarrangement, and the child will have brown eyes. If it's disarrangement, okay, so I might get the dominant version from the mother, the recessive version from the father, it'll be this arrangement, or it could be this. And what we can see then is based on the genotype of both of the parents, the offspring has a 1 in 4 chance, so 1 in 4 chance of having blue eyes, and has a 3 in 4 chance of having brown eyes. So these are what are known as genetic crosses, and are useful ways to make predictions on like what traits will be passed on from mother and father to offspring. Another way to show this information is what's known as a pedigree chart. So a pedigree chart is a diagram that shows the occurrence and appearance of phenotypes of a particular gene or organism and its ancestors from one generation to the next. So when we have a look at this, so let's say this would be the parents, and then we have down here would be the first generation, and then down here we would have the second generation. So in this example, squares represent males. Okay, so each of these squares here represents a male, and circles represent females. So each of these circles here represents a female. Shaded in shapes show the presence of two recessive genes in the organism, and shapes that are not shaded have at least one dominant gene and therefore have the dominant characteristic. So it means that if it's in red, for example, that means that that male or that female, for example, has at least one of the dominant versions of the gene. So therefore, that dominant gene will be expressed in that person. So this example here shows it's looking at what's called sickle cell anemia. So sickle cell anemia is a genetic condition that affects the red blood cells. So if we take a red blood cell, so a healthy red blood cell is kind of like a donut shape like this. And what red blood cells do, they allow oxygen. So imagine this is oxygen. They allow oxygen to attach onto it. So once it's this kind of donut shape, it will be able to carry the maximum amount of oxygen that it needs to carry. Now, what can happen is an individual can be born what's known as sickle cell, and basically what happens is the red blood cell kind of has this type of a shape. So it can carry some oxygen, but it can't carry the same amount of oxygen as this. And if we think about then, so this is, so let's say this is healthy. So this is like, let's say a healthy red blood cell. And then this is what's known as sickle cell. So this is a sickle cell. So basically the way to kind of think about it is, so how does this person get this? So what happens is they have, so remember you have a gene. The gene codes for a protein. And the protein gives a particular trait. Okay, so the gene is the genotype. So remember the gene is the genotype, and then the protein is the phenotype. And then the trait is like what that protein, what trait it gives. So for example, if we take a red blood cell, it's made up of proteins. And there will be a specific gene, for example, for healthy red blood cells, and then there will be a specific gene for sickle red blood cells. So imagine if we'll call let's say the gene is, we'll call it an S. Okay, so S, the dominant version. If the person has the dominant version in their, at least one dominant version of the gene in their allele, they will have this type of red blood cell. Whereas if they have the recessive, okay, they're going to have, so imagine the dominant, it gives you this, the recessive, it gives you this. Okay, so if the individual then, if the individual has this combination, so let's say the parents, let's say the offspring, if they get this arrangement here, they're going to have sickle cell, because remember the dominant version of the gene will be expressed over the recessive. If they have this version, they're going to have sickle cell. If they have this version here, so small s, they will have normal healthy cells. And this is essentially what's happening here. So what we can see is, if we have a look at this, so this individual here, so male not suffering with sickle cell anemia, or if it's in red, it's a male suffering with sickle cell anemia. So basically what it means is that if we look at, so these are like a mother and a father, so we can see here that the father has, so the father would basically have this arrangement here, SS, the small s. Okay, so they have healthy red blood cells. The mother has the dominant version, has this in her genes. Okay, so has this sickle cell. So depending on, let's say when these, like when they reproduce, for example, there's a chance that the child may inherit the dominant gene. Okay, there's also a chance that the child may inherit let's say they may get this small s from the mother and then one of these small s's from the father. So there's a chance that the child could have healthy blood cells. But then there's also a chance as well that the child could end up with this version. So they could end up with, let's say, the dominant version from the mother and not the recessive version from the father, and end up with this version, and the child will have like sickle cell anemia. So again, this is what's called a pedigree chart, and it's a way to represent, for example, the passing on of genetic information from one generation to the next. So that is that's this section covered. So just to kind of reflect on what we went through, so students should be able to describe. So we talked about asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. And then we explored a pattern in the inheritance and variation of genetically controlled characteristics. So we talked about how genes, for example, code for proteins, and then proteins give the different characteristics that we have. And genes are passed on then through reproduction, and those genes, depending on the type of genes that you will have certain types of proteins, and those proteins will give you certain types of characteristics. We looked at genetic crosses, and we looked at pedigree charts then as well. And that is this section covered.